modern vegetables are treated as fragile things. You plant them, protect them, feed them, and within months they are gone. Their disappearance feels normal, expected, even inevitable. Vegetables, we're told, are temporary by nature. They belong to a season, not a lifetime. This assumption is so deeply embedded that few people ever question it. But for most of agricultural history, vegetables were not weak, temporary, or disposable. They were powerful, powerful enough to reshape labor, land use, and dependence itself. And that power is exactly why they did not survive modern agriculture. For centuries, European farmers grew vegetables that did not need to be replanted every year. These were not rare curiosities or luxury crops. They were staples. They returned on their own. They deepened soil instead of exhausting it. They reduced labor instead of increasing it. They quietly broke one of the core assumptions that modern food systems rely on: that food must be constantly replaced. A vegetable that comes back without permission is not just a plant. It is a disruption. In a world where survival depended on efficiency, endurance mattered more than speed. Medieval farmers lived with famine, war, and unpredictable weather. They could not afford systems that collapsed easily. A garden that died every winter and had to be rebuilt from scratch was not resilient. It was dangerous. So they selected plants that refused to disappear. Vegetables that anchored gardens year after year, regardless of neglect, hardship, or human absence. These vegetables changed the economics of food at the household level. When a crop returns reliably, it reduces uncertainty. When it lives for decades, it reduces labor. When it regenerates without seed, it reduces dependency. Each of these traits shifts power away from markets and toward growers. That shift was once normal. Later, it became unacceptable. The strength of these vegetables was not dramatic. It was quiet. They did not produce flashy yields in their first season. Many required patience. Some demanded years before reaching full production. But once established, they became nearly irreplaceable. They turned time into an ally. The longer they lived, the more valuable they became. This is where modern thinking struggles to follow. Today, productivity is measured per season. Medieval farmers measured productivity per lifetime. A plant that fed you for 20 years was more productive than one that fed you for one, even if the first year's harvest was smaller. The modern system reverses that logic entirely. When agriculture shifted from survival to commerce, vegetables stopped being judged by how well they sustained people and started being judged by how quickly they moved through markets. Speed replaced endurance. Uniformity replaced resilience. Replaceability replaced permanence. Vegetables that lived too long became a problem. A crop that does not need replacing interferes with predictable sales cycles. A plant that regenerates on its own does not fit neatly into annual accounting. A garden that improves with age undermines the idea that productivity requires constant input. These vegetables did not fail agronomically. They failed economically, at least from the perspective of systems built on turnover. The disappearance was subtle. No one outlawed these crops. They were simply sidelined. Seed catalogs stopped listing them. Agricultural education stopped teaching them. Research funding ignored them. Within a few generations, vegetables that once fed entire regions were reduced to footnotes, curiosities, or forgotten names. As this happened, a new story took hold: that vegetables are inherently short-lived, that replanting is unavoidable, that dependency is natural. Once that story hardened into common sense, the absence of long-lived vegetables stopped feeling like a loss. Most people never knew they existed in the first place, yet the biology never changed. These vegetables did not become weaker. They did not stop growing. They were not outcompete by better plants. They were pushed aside by systems that could not tolerate their independence. This chapter is not about blaming modern agriculture for everything that followed. It is about recognizing an incompatibility. Vegetables that endure for decades do not belong easily in systems designed around yearly replacement. Their power lies in refusing to reset, and that refusal is precisely what made them dangerous. Before examining how these vegetables worked or which ones survived longest, it is important to understand this first truth: they did not disappear because they were inefficient. They disappeared because they challenged the assumption that food should always be temporary. Once you see that, the next chapters stop being about gardening and start being about power: who holds it, how it's maintained, and why some plants were never meant to survive a system built on constant replacement. To understand why certain vegetables once held so much power, you have to understand the world that shaped them. Medieval farmers did not live in a system of convenience. There were no guarantees, no safety nets, no global supply chains waiting to fill gaps. Food security was not an abstract concept, it was survival itself. And because survival mattered, medieval agriculture was built around one principle above all others: endurance. Medieval gardens were not seasonal experiments. They were long-term infrastructure. A successful garden was expected to function through bad weather, failed harvests, labor shortages, and political chaos. It was expected to feed people even when trade stopped and fields failed. That expectation shaped every planting decision. Crops were chosen not for how quickly they produced, but for how reliably they returned. This is where medieval farmers held a quiet advantage over modern systems. They designed food production around time, not speed. They understood that the most valuable crops were not those that produced immediately, but those that continued producing with less effort each year. A plant that demanded patience once and then provided for decades was far more efficient than one that required constant restarting. Monastery gardens made this logic explicit. These were not small, symbolic plots. They were carefully planned food systems meant to sustain entire communities. Monks documented what worked and what failed over generations. If a crop exhausted soil, required constant replanting, or failed unpredictably, it was gradually removed. If a plant returned year after year, stabilized the garden, and reduced labor, it was preserved and propagated. The result was a garden anchored by perennial vegetables. These plants formed the backbone of medieval food security. They emerged early in the season, often before annual crops could be planted. They continued producing when annuals failed. Their deep roots accessed water and nutrients unavailable to shallow-rooted plants. In times of stress, they were the difference between scarcity and survival. This advantage was not theoretical. During famines, monasteries often remained functional long after surrounding farms collapsed. Their gardens produced when fields failed because they were not dependent on perfect conditions. Perennial vegetables buffered risk. They absorbed shocks. They provided baseline nutrition when everything else was uncertain. The medieval food advantage was also social. When a garden does not need to be restarted every year, labor can be redirected. Time spent reseeding and reworking soil could be used for repairing tools, caring for the sick, preserving food, or teaching skills. Food systems that required less constant intervention created space for culture, learning, and resilience. Importantly, this advantage did not rely on advanced technology. It relied on selection and observation. Medieval farmers did not understand soil chemistry as we define it today, but they understood outcomes. They knew which plants improved soil structure, which reduced erosion, and which demanded too much for too little return. Their knowledge was empirical, accumulated through repetition across centuries. This is why the medieval system produced vegetables that modern agriculture struggles to accommodate. These crops were not optimized for yield per acre in a single season. They were optimized for stability across decades. They worked slowly, but they worked reliably. Their productivity increased over time rather than declining. Modern agriculture reversed these priorities. It measures success by output per season, not continuity per generation. Under that lens, the medieval advantage becomes invisible. A plant that takes 3 years to reach full production looks inefficient, even if it feeds people for 20 years afterward. The time horizon collapses, and with it, the value of endurance. But in the medieval context, the opposite was true. A plant that demanded annual replacement was considered weak. It was tolerated only if it filled a specific gap or provided something perennials could not. The foundation of the system rested on plants that stayed. This is the critical point. Medieval farmers did not accidentally stumble into powerful vegetables. They deliberately selected them. They understood that food systems should get stronger with time, not weaker. They planted for continuity because continuity was power. That power did not come from dominance or control. It came from predictability, from knowing that when spring arrived, something would return whether markets functioned or not. In a world defined by uncertainty, that predictability was the greatest advantage a farmer could have. And it is precisely this advantage, quiet, cumulative, and resistant to replacement, that modern agriculture would later find incompatible with its own priorities. Once medieval farmers built their food systems around endurance, certain vegetables naturally rose to the top. These were not chosen for novelty or yield alone. They were chosen because they refused to create dependence. Once planted, they reduced the need for seed buying, labor, and outside inputs. They quietly made growers more self-sufficient, year after year. Asparagus was one of the clearest examples. When planted, it demanded patience, several years of waiting before any harvest. But once established, it returned every spring for decades. The same bed fed multiple generations without reseeding. Its deep roots accessed nutrients far below the reach of annual crops, making it resilient to drought and soil exhaustion. From a survival perspective, asparagus was not a vegetable. It was infrastructure. Leafy greens followed the same principle. Plants like Good King Henry produced edible shoots in early spring, leafy greens throughout the growing season, and even usable flower buds later on. Harvesting did not kill the plant, it encouraged regrowth. One planting eliminated the need for repeated sowing of annual greens. In times when seed access was uncertain, this reliability mattered more than abundance. Flavor crops such as lovage played a different but equally important role. A single plant grew tall, returned every year, and flavored entire meals with minimal harvesting. It reduced reliance on preserved spices and trade goods. One plant replaced countless purchases. Its value was measured not in yield per square foot, but in how much it simplified daily life. Root vegetables demonstrated another form of independence. Skirret produced clusters of sweet roots that could be harvested selectively, leaving the plant alive to regenerate. Rhubarb stored energy underground, dying back in winter and returning stronger each spring, often for decades. These crops blurred the line between harvest and survival storage. They could be left in the ground and accessed when needed, without reseeding or replanting. Artichokes introduced renewal through division. Individual plants declined over time, but they produced offsets, new plants emerging from the base. Instead of returning to seed, gardeners divided these offsets and replanted them, preserving the crop indefinitely. One original planting could supply new plants for generations. Seeds became optional, not essential. Even aggressive plants had their place. Horseradish spread relentlessly once established. That persistence was a feature, not a flaw. It thrived in poor soil and neglected corners where other crops failed. Any root fragment left behind could regenerate. In unstable conditions, that kind of stubborn survival was invaluable. What united these crops was their refusal to reset annually. They did not align with the logic of replacement. They demanded patience once and then rewarded it repeatedly. They reduced labor over time instead of increasing it. They turned gardens into systems rather than projects. Because these plants returned on their own, medieval farmers did not organize their food systems around seed purchasing. Seeds were used to introduce new plants or adapt to changing conditions, but they were not the foundation. The foundation was permanence. This mattered socially as well as biologically. A garden that renews itself allows knowledge to accumulate. Families and communities learned how specific plants behaved over decades. They learned where they thrived, how much to harvest, and how to propagate them without starting over. That knowledge created independence from markets and supply chains long before those concepts existed. Modern agriculture flipped this logic. It centered systems on plants that must be recreated every year. That shift transformed seeds from tools into necessities. What had once been optional became mandatory. The crops themselves did not change. Their biology remained the same. What changed was the system surrounding them. Vegetables that refused to depend on annual replacement became incompatible with a world organized around constant transactions. Their power lay in making replacement unnecessary. And that quiet refusal to depend is exactly what made them unsustainable, at least within the economics of modern agriculture. The vegetables themselves did not disappear because they stopped working. They disappeared because the world around them changed in a way that made their strengths inconvenient. As agriculture shifted from survival-based systems to market-driven ones, the very traits that once made these crops valuable began to work against them. Permanence, patience, and self-renewal, qualities that had sustained communities for centuries, became obstacles in an economy built on speed and turnover. Modern agriculture requires predictability above all else. Crops must mature on schedule, harvest uniformly, and clear from fields at the same time. This allows machinery, labor, storage, and distribution to operate efficiently. Perennial vegetables do not cooperate with this logic. They do not reset cleanly at the end of a season. They mature unevenly. They occupy land continuously. They blur the neat boundaries of annual planning. From an industrial perspective, they are messy. Annual crops, by contrast, are perfectly compliant. They begin and end on command. Fields can be cleared, replanted, and reprogrammed every year. Inputs can be calculated precisely. Outputs can be projected. Most importantly, the system creates recurring demand. Seeds must be purchased. Fertility must be replaced. Equipment must be used again and again. The cycle sustains itself economically, even if it exhausts the land biologically. This is where perennial vegetables became a problem, not because they were inefficient, but because they undermined repetition. A crop that feeds people for 20 years from one planting interrupts annual sales. A garden that improves with age reduces dependence on fertilizers, seed suppliers, and constant intervention. That kind of independence does not scale well in markets designed around constant exchange. The shift did not require explicit suppression. It happened through neglect and omission. Seed catalogs gradually stopped offering long-lived vegetables. Agricultural research prioritized crops that could be bred quickly and replaced easily. Education focused on methods that fit industrial models. Over time, the absence of perennial vegetables became self-reinforcing. What was not taught was not planted. What was not planted was forgotten. Cultural expectations changed alongside economics. Patience came to be seen as inefficiency. Waiting several years for a crop to reach full production seemed irrational in a system obsessed with immediate returns. The idea of planting something you might not personally harvest felt outdated. Food production narrowed its time horizon, and anything that operated outside that horizon was labeled impractical. Even language shifted. Perennial systems were described as old-fashioned or unproductive, while high-input annual systems were labeled modern and advanced. Yield per season replaced yield over time as the primary measure of success. Under this metric, long-lived crops always lost, regardless of how much they produced over decades. What's important to understand is that none of this was driven by better biology. The plants did not fail trials. They were not outperformed nutritionally. They were simply incompatible with a system that required constant replacement to function. Their strength, endurance, made them economically inconvenient. By the time this incompatibility became obvious, the transition was already complete. Generations had grown up without seeing vegetables that returned reliably year after year. The idea that such plants were once common sounded implausible. The system had normalized fragility so thoroughly that permanence itself felt unnatural. When power became a problem, it wasn't eliminated through force. It was made invisible. The vegetables that once anchored food security were quietly pushed to the margins, not because they couldn't survive, but because they refused to conform. And in a system built on constant renewal through consumption, refusal is the one thing that cannot be tolerated. When perennial vegetables faded from everyday agriculture, the loss was not obvious at first. Fields still produced food. Markets stayed full. New varieties promised higher yields and faster results. But beneath that appearance of progress, something fundamental had changed. Food systems stopped accumulating strength over time and began resetting themselves instead. What was lost was not just certain crops, but an entire layer of resilience that had once made agriculture durable. The most immediate loss was stability. Perennial vegetables acted as anchors. They returned even when weather was poor, labor was scarce, or planting schedules were disrupted. When these crops disappeared, food systems became more sensitive to timing. Miss a season, lose a year. Lose access to inputs, lose production. Stability gave way to precision, and precision is fragile. Soil health suffered quietly. Long-lived plants protect soil continuously. Their roots hold structure, feed microorganisms, and prevent erosion year after year. Annual systems disturb soil repeatedly. Each disturbance weakens structure and accelerates nutrient loss. Over time, fertility must be replaced artificially. What was once maintained biologically became something purchased. Soil stopped being a living system and became a medium to be managed. Labor demands increased, even as tools improved. Perennial systems front-load effort and then reduce it. Annual systems require constant repetition. Clearing, tilling, sowing, thinning, replanting. These tasks never accumulate into long-term ease. Each year begins at the same starting line. Modern agriculture calls this efficiency. Medieval farmers would have called it waste. Knowledge declined alongside this shift. Managing perennial vegetables requires observation over years. You learn how plants respond to seasons, how to divide them, when to harvest without weakening them. These skills disappear when replacement becomes the default. Why learn to propagate when you can buy a substitute? Over time, practical understanding was replaced with instructions and inputs. Diversity narrowed as well. Perennial crops are often regionally adapted, shaped by local conditions over generations. When agriculture standardized around annual varieties, local diversity was replaced by uniformity. Uniform systems look productive under ideal conditions, but they fail dramatically under stress. The old gardens absorbed shocks because they were varied. The new ones require control to survive. Perhaps the deepest loss was psychological. Perennial gardens teach continuity. They remind growers that systems can improve with age. Annual systems teach impermanence. Everything is temporary. Everything must be replaced. That expectation shapes how people relate not just to food, but to stability itself. When collapse is built into the cycle, resilience feels unattainable. The removal of powerful vegetables also shifted power away from growers. A garden that cannot reproduce itself ties its keeper to external systems. Seeds, fertilizers, and replacements become necessities rather than options. Food production becomes vulnerable to market disruptions, price changes, and supply failures. What once provided security now mirrors the instability of the broader economy. This dependency did not arrive through force. It arrived through convenience. Each step seemed logical. Each replacement felt easier than maintenance. Over time, the old alternatives disappeared from memory. When people stopped seeing gardens that matured and endured, they stopped imagining that such systems were possible at all. What was lost, then, was not simply a list of vegetables. It was a different relationship with time. Medieval agriculture assumed that today's work should reduce tomorrow's effort. Modern agriculture often does the opposite. It produces abundance in the short term by borrowing against the future. The irony is that the vegetables removed from mainstream agriculture were not inefficient. They were too effective at reducing dependency. They produced food without demanding constant transactions. They rewarded patience instead of urgency. They made replacement optional. In removing them, agriculture did not become stronger. It became faster, and speed, when mistaken for progress, often hides fragility. The disappearance of these vegetables reshaped food systems so thoroughly that most people no longer recognize what's missing. But the consequences are visible everywhere. Exhausted soil, rising input costs, and systems that work only as long as everything goes right. The next question is unavoidable. If these vegetables were removed because they worked too well, what happens when the systems that replace them begin to fail? The vegetables that once anchored medieval food systems never truly vanished. They survived in monastery remnants, cottage gardens, seed-saving circles, and forgotten corners of rural land. What disappeared was not the plants themselves, but the context that made them visible. Now, as modern agricultural systems strain under their own weight, that context is beginning to return. Rising costs are the first signal. Seeds, fertilizers, and soil amendments grow more expensive each year. What once felt affordable now feels precarious. For many gardeners and small growers, the math no longer works. When every season requires new purchases, food production becomes vulnerable to price shifts far beyond the grower's control. In that environment, vegetables that return on their own begin to look less like curiosities and more like solutions. Soil exhaustion is another pressure point. Annual systems demand constant disturbance. Over time, this depletes organic matter and weakens structure. Growers respond with more inputs, which provide short-term gains but deepen long-term dependency. Perennial vegetables offer a different path. Their deep roots stabilize soil, feed microbial life, and rebuild fertility naturally. As soil health becomes harder to maintain through products alone, biological solutions regain relevance. Climate instability has also changed the equation. Unpredictable weather punishes systems that rely on precise timing. Late frosts, heat waves, and irregular rainfall can wipe out annual plantings in a single event. Perennial vegetables, already established and resilient, are better positioned to survive these disruptions. They do not need to be replanted into chaos. They are already there, waiting. Cultural shifts play a role as well. More people are questioning systems that require constant replacement to function. The idea that food production should reduce effort over time rather than increase it is quietly reemerging. Perennials fit this mindset naturally. They reward long-term thinking in a way annual systems cannot. Technology, ironically, is helping this rediscovery. Information that once lived only in obscure texts or local traditions is now accessible again. Gardeners can learn about forgotten vegetables, share experiences, and rebuild lost knowledge. The barrier is no longer access to information, but willingness to think beyond a single season. Importantly, this return is not driven by nostalgia. It is driven by necessity. Perennial vegetables are not being rediscovered because they are romantic. They are being rediscovered because they solve problems modern systems struggle to address. They reduce dependency. They increase resilience. They stabilize production without demanding constant inputs. The path forward does not require abandoning modern agriculture entirely. Medieval systems had limits. Labor was hard. Yields were often lower in the short term. But the principles that guided them remained sound. Anchor systems and permanence. Minimize unnecessary repetition. Let time work for you instead of against you. Starting small is enough. One long-lived vegetable changes the rhythm of a garden. It creates a reference point, a reminder that not everything must be temporary. As these plants mature, they quietly rebuild the idea that food systems can endure. The return of these vegetables marks a subtle shift in power. It moves a small amount of control back to the grower. It reduces exposure to markets and supply chains. It restores confidence that food can come from continuity rather than constant purchase. These vegetables were once considered too powerful for modern agriculture because they disrupted the logic of replacement. Now, as that logic shows its limits, their power looks less like a threat and more like a necessity. They are not returning because the past was perfect. They are returning because permanence still works. In a world increasingly defined by instability, vegetables that refuse to disappear offer something rare: reliability without dependence. And that quiet endurance may be exactly what the future of food requires.